The main street of Laramie, Wyoming, on a morning in the middle of May, 1888. The street was empty from the train platform to the courthouse. 300 men and women of that town stood silent along the wooden sidewalks, and not one of them moved, and not one of them spoke. Shopkeepers had closed their doors. Mothers had pulled their children inside. The bell in the church tower at the east end of the street had gone still. 2 men stood in the packed dirt of the street 20 paces apart. The first man wore a black wool frock coat and a wide, dark hat. His right hand rested easy at his side 6 inches above the butt of a Colt revolver. His face was the face of a man who had made his peace with whatever came next. His name was Holden Caldwell, and he owned a cattle ranch 25 miles north of where he now stood. And there was a dark-haired woman watching him from the courthouse porch, with her hand pressed against her mouth. The second man wore a fine suit tailored in Boston. His right hand was shaking. In it he held a Smith & Wesson revolver that he did not know how to use properly. His face was pale, and it bore a long purple scar from his left temple to the point of his jaw, and his name was Dr. Thaddeus Ashford. Doctor, Holden Caldwell's voice carried in the still air. I gave you the chance to walk to the gallows like a man. You chose the gun instead. I will not ask you again. Lay it down. You would not shoot an unarmed physician, Mr. Caldwell. I would shoot a wolf who came onto my land to kill my wife, Doctor. And that is what you are. The scarred man's hand came up. Holden Caldwell's hand came up faster. Cut to black. 6 months earlier, these 2 men had never laid eyes on each other. One was a rancher mourning a dead wife and a dead son. The other was a Boston surgeon hiding a darkness that had already killed 5 women. And between them stood a nurse freezing to death in an empty train station on the coldest night Wyoming had ever seen. This is the story of how a single act of kindness on a night when no one was watching changed the course of every life it touched. This is the story of the millionaire cowboy and the freezing nurse. The wind came down from the Rockies that December evening in 1887, like a living thing howling across the Wyoming plains with teeth made of ice. It tore at the wooden shingles of the Laramie train station, rattled the windows in their frames, and buried the rail tracks under 3 feet of fresh powder. The thermometer nailed to the station master's door had read 30 below zero at sundown. By 9 o'clock that night, the mercury had disappeared entirely into the bulb. Inside the empty waiting room, a woman sat on a hard wooden bench that felt like a slab of frozen iron beneath her. Her name was Adeline Bellamy, though nobody in this territory knew it yet. She was 25 years old, the daughter of a Confederate surgeon, and she was slowly freezing to death. Her breath came out in pale white clouds that hung in the air before vanishing into the darkness. She had pulled her thin woolen shawl tight around her shoulders hours ago, but the fabric had long since stopped holding warmth. Her fingertips had gone from burning pain to numb tingling to nothing at all. She could no longer feel her toes inside her worn leather boots. She had stopped shivering 40 minutes earlier, and some small part of her mind that still remembered her nurse's training knew exactly what that meant. When the body stops shivering, death is not far behind. On the bench beside her sat a leather medical case, weathered and scarred, the brass clasp worn smooth from 30 years of use. Inside that case were the surgical instruments her father had carried through the battlefields of Virginia. A bone saw, forceps, 3 scalpels with ivory handles yellowed by age, a small tin of catgut suture, The tools that had saved boys at Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville and Gettysburg. The tools that had made him, before he died, whisper to her that a daughter who could hold a surgeon's blade was worth more than 10 sons who could only hold a rifle. She clutched that case against her chest, now the way another woman might clutch a child. It was the last thing she owned in the world. Her wedding ring, had she possessed one, would have been easier to surrender. Outside, somewhere in the white void beyond the station, a coyote called out and was answered by another. Adeline lifted her head at the sound. Her neck ached from the cold. Her lips had turned a strange blue-gray color she had only ever seen before on cadavers. She thought of her father, then of his weathered hands teaching her how to tie a surgeon's knot when she was only 9 years old. She thought of her mother dead from consumption when Adeline was 15, buried in the red Virginia clay beneath a dogwood tree. She thought of Dr. Thaddeus Ashford and what he had tried to do to her in that supply closet at Richmond Memorial Hospital 5 weeks ago. She thought of the scalpel she had driven across his face when he put his hands on her throat. And she began very quietly to sing. It was an old hymn, her father's favorite, the one he had sung to wounded boys who were dying in field tents, the one he had sung at her mother's graveside, the one he had whispered as his own breath grew thin and final. She sang it now not because she believed anyone would hear her, but because she did not want to die in silence. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Her voice was cracked and faint and weaker than she had ever heard it, but it filled the empty waiting room and it slipped through the cracks in the station walls, and it drifted out into the storm. I once was lost, but now am found. And somewhere, nearly 200 yards down the frozen main street of Laramie, a man on a tall buckskin horse reined up short and turned his head. His name was Holden Caldwell. He was 31 years old. He had been a cavalryman in the United States Army and a rancher for the better part of the last decade, and a widower for 3 years and 2 months. He had just come from the office of his attorney, Percival Brooks, where he had spent 4 hours trying to figure out where in God's creation a man could find a qualified nurse willing to come work on a cattle ranch 200 miles from anywhere civilized. He had buried a boy named Mortimer Dooley 15 days ago. Mortimer had been 19 years old. He had ridden for the Broken Arrow brand for 8 months, and he had died screaming of septic infection from a cut on his thigh that should have taken 10 stitches and 2 weeks of rest. Instead, it had killed him over 6 agonizing days, because there had been no one on the ranch who knew more about medicine than how to pour whiskey on an open wound and pray. Holden had made a promise at that graveside. He had promised Mortimer's mother, a widow in Cheyenne who had lost her husband to a rock fall in a silver mine the year before, that no other boy who rode for him would die for lack of a healer. And Holden Caldwell was a man who kept his promises, or he was nothing at all. He had stopped his horse because he thought he heard singing. It was impossible, of course. The wind was too loud. The cold was too deep. Any sensible person in Laramie that night was inside with a fire and a bottle. But he sat still in the saddle for a long moment, the snow piling on the brim of his wide black hat, and he listened. Was blind, but now I see. The voice was faint, nearly gone, but it was real. And it was coming from the train station. Holden turned the buckskin around. He later told his wife in the long years that came after that he did not know why. He turned around that night. He had been warm in his sheepskin coat. The hotel was only 3 blocks away. A hot meal and a bed with clean sheets waited for him. A sensible man, a man concerned with his own comfort, would have ridden on. But his mother had raised him on Scripture before she died, and his father, God rest him, had once told him that a man's measure in this life was taken not by what he did when the world was watching, but by what he did when no one was there to see. So he turned his horse. He rode to the Laramie train station through the driving snow, dismounted by the hitching post, and pushed through the heavy oak door. What he saw inside the waiting room would stay with him until the day he died. A young woman sat on the far bench, slumped against the wall. Her dark hair had come loose from its pins and hung in frozen strands around her face. Her lips were the color of a deep bruise. Her eyes were half open and unfocused, staring at something Holden could not see. In her arms, held tight against her chest, was a leather medical case. She was still singing. Barely. A whisper now. Holden crossed that waiting room in 4 long strides. He knelt in front of her. He pulled off his leather glove with his teeth and pressed 2 bare fingers against the side of her throat. The pulse was there, but it was slow. Too slow. The kind of slow a man sees in a horse that has been run until its heart is about to stop. "Ma'am." His voice came out rougher than he intended. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" Her eyes drifted toward the sound. They tried to focus on him and failed. "Papa," she whispered. Something broke loose in Holden Caldwell's chest. Something that had been buried under 3 years of grief and whiskey and silence. He had not been called Papa by anyone. He had buried his only child, a son named after his father, still wet from birth, in a small pine box beside his wife's coffin. But he understood in that moment that this woman was speaking to a ghost. He understood because he had spoken to ghosts himself. "No, ma'am," he said quietly. "My name is Holden Caldwell. I own a ranch 25 miles north of here. And I'm going to get you out of this cold right now." She did not answer. Her eyes had closed. He unbuckled his heavy buffalo hide coat and wrapped it around her shoulders, tucking it in close against her body. He gathered the leather medical case in one arm. Then he slid the other arm beneath her knees and lifted her, as if she weighed no more than a bundle of winter wheat. She was light, too light. He could feel her bones beneath the thin fabric of her traveling dress. He carried her out into the storm. The buckskin stood patient at the hitching post, shaking snow from its mane. Holden mounted with the woman cradled against him, her head resting beneath his chin, and he kicked the horse into a canter down the frozen main street of Laramie. He did not ride to the hotel. He rode to the house of Dr. Phineas Cartwright. Dr. Cartwright was a white-bearded man of 68 years, a veteran surgeon who had served in 3 Indian campaigns and now practiced medicine out of a 2-room cabin at the edge of town. He opened his door on the second knock, took one look at the frozen woman in Holden's arms, and stepped aside without a word. "Lay her on the table. Strip off those wet clothes. Get the stove going." Holden did as he was told. For the next 2 hours, Dr. Cartwright worked over Adeline Bellamy the way a jeweler works over a cracked spoon. He warmed water on the stove in graduated increments. He wrapped her extremities in damp cloths that slowly rose in temperature. He massaged her arms and legs with his weathered old hands to restore the circulation. When the smallest finger on her left hand began to turn black with the promise of gangrene, he applied warm compresses in a tincture of his own making, and he saved it. Holden sat in a wooden chair 3 feet away and watched. He did not speak. He did not move. His revolver rested on his right thigh, the hammer uncocked, but his thumb resting near it. He did not know why he was armed. He only knew that something in his gut told him this woman had not come to this territory by accident, and whatever had driven her west might come looking for her still. It was past midnight when Dr. Cartwright finally stepped back from the table. "She'll live," the old doctor said. "Lost some skin on her toes. The finger came close, but she'll live." Holden let out a breath he had not realized he was holding. "What's her name?" "Don't know yet. She's been too cold to speak." Dr. Cartwright lifted the leather medical case from where Holden had set it on the floor. He placed it on the table beside her sleeping form and opened the brass clasp. What he saw inside made his eyebrows climb toward his hairline. Son of a gun. "What is it?" The old doctor lifted out a scalpel with an ivory handle. Then another. Then a bone saw older than either man in the room. "These are surgeon's tools, old ones, quality work, made in Philadelphia, I'd guess, before the war." He turned the scalpel in the lamplight. "There's an inscription on the handle. Reginald Bellamy, surgeon, 3rd Virginia. Holden leaned forward. "She's a surgeon. She's somebody's daughter." Dr. Cartwright set the scalpel back in its velvet bed with careful hands. "Reginald Bellamy was a field surgeon for Lee's army. A good one. I met a man once who'd been under his knife at Gettysburg. Said Bellamy saved his leg when 3 other doctors would have taken it off at the hip." He closed the case. "This woman is carrying her daddy's tools, and she's got training Holden. A woman doesn't carry these unless she knows how to use them." Holden looked at the sleeping woman on the table. Her dark hair was beginning to dry. There was color coming back to her cheeks. She was beautiful in a way he had not let himself notice before. A quiet beauty, the kind that came from bone structure and character rather than paint. A trained nurse. A trained nurse here in Laramie on the very night he had ridden into town looking for one. Holden Caldwell was not a superstitious man. He had seen too much in the war to believe that any kind God ordered the affairs of men. But he was a man who believed in signs, and he believed that sometimes when a man made a promise at a graveside, the Almighty might deign to answer him. He took off his hat and held it in his hands. "Doc, I need you to keep her here tonight. I'll cover your fee, and I'll pay for whatever care she needs. In the morning, I'd like to speak with her." Dr. Cartwright studied him for a long moment. "Holden, that is a scared young woman lying on my table. She has come a long way from somewhere, and she has not come by choice. Whatever you're thinking of asking her, you ask it gentle." "Yes, sir, I will." He rode back to the hotel through the tail end of the storm. He did not sleep that night. He sat in his room in a straight-back chair by the window and watched the snow fall. And he thought about a woman singing hymns in an empty train station, and about the promises a man makes to the dead. Morning came gray and still. The wind had died sometime before dawn. and the town of Laramie lay under a clean white blanket that sparkled in the thin December sunlight. Holden ate a breakfast he did not taste, shaved with a fresh razor, and put on a clean white shirt. Then he walked to Dr. Cartwright's cabin and knocked gently on the door. Adeline Bellamy was awake. She was sitting up in the doctor's bed in a borrowed nightgown, a heavy quilt pulled up to her shoulders. Her dark hair plaited in a long braid over her left shoulder. Her eyes, now that Holden could see them properly, were a clear gray-blue, the color of winter sky after a snowfall. She watched him enter the room the way a deer watches a hunter at the edge of a meadow. "Good morning, Miss Bellamy." Her face changed at the sound of her own name. Suspicion hardened in her eyes. "How do you know my name?" "Your father's name is inscribed on his surgical tools." Holden removed his hat and held it against his chest. "I took a chance. My name is Holden Caldwell. I'm the man who brought you here last night." "From the station." "Yes, ma'am." She studied him. He let her study him. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair graying prematurely at the temples, and eyes the color of storm clouds. There was a long scar on the back of his right hand. He held his hat the way a churchgoer holds his hat brim up, crown in his palm. He did not look like any man she had met at Richmond Memorial Hospital. "Why did you help me?" It was not a question. It was a demand. Holden thought about his answer carefully before he gave it. "Because if I had kept riding, I wouldn't have been able to look at myself in a mirror again. And I have to shave in the morning, Miss Bellamy. So I turned around." Something in her face softened. Not much, but something. "Dr. Cartwright tells me you have surgical training," Holden continued. "He tells me you're the daughter of a Confederate field surgeon. He was a surgeon, not a Confederate. He served the wounded of his state, Mr. Caldwell. He did not serve a cause." "I stand corrected, ma'am. I am a nurse, a trained nurse. I worked at Richmond Memorial Hospital for 4 years before." She stopped. Her jaw tightened. "Before circumstances forced me to leave." Holden did not ask her what circumstances. He suspected, looking at her, that he did not want to know. Not yet. Not until she was ready to tell him. "Miss Bellamy, I own a ranch north of here. 75,000 acres. I run about 1,200 head of cattle and 50 horses, and I employ 45 men year-round. 2 weeks ago, I buried a 19-year-old boy named Mortimer Dooley. He died of a septic infection from a cut that should not have killed him. There was no one on my ranch who could treat him properly. I made a promise to his mother that no other boy under my roof would die for that same reason." He paused. He had not meant to say so much. "I came to Laramie yesterday looking for a nurse. I did not find one. And then coming out of my attorney's office, I heard a woman singing Amazing Grace inside the train station." Her eyes filled suddenly with tears she refused to let fall. "I am offering you employment, Miss Bellamy. $45 a month. Your own cabin. A room outfitted as a proper infirmary with whatever supplies you require. Meals prepared by my cook. And the respect of 45 men who will call you ma'am and tip their hats when you pass. You would be the nurse of the Broken Arrow Ranch. Nothing more and nothing less." She was silent for a long time. When she spoke, her voice was careful. "Mr. Caldwell, I have learned in my short life that no man offers a woman anything without expecting something in return. What is it that you expect?" "I expect you to treat my men when they are hurt. I expect you to do your work honestly and to accept fair pay for it. That is all I expect, Miss Bellamy. And if you fear otherwise, I can give you the names of every Christian family in Laramie. They will vouch for my character. My late wife's name was Cordelia. She is buried on my land. I have loved one woman in my life, and I have buried her. I am not looking to court you. I am looking to hire you. She searched his face for the lie. She did not find it. I will try it, she said at last. For 3 months. If the situation is not as you describe, I will leave, and you will not prevent me. You have my word. And Mr. Caldwell. Her voice sharpened. I am armed. I have been armed since I left Virginia. I will remain armed. Should any man at your ranch mistake my position, I will defend myself. Do you understand? Holden Caldwell inclined his head. Miss Bellamy, if any man on my ranch gives you cause to draw a weapon, you will not need it. I will handle the matter myself. She believed him. She did not know why, but she believed him. That afternoon, while Adeline rested at Dr. Cartwright's cabin, Holden walked to the general store and purchased her a proper winter coat, a pair of sheepskin-lined riding boots, heavy wool stockings, and a thick traveling cloak. He paid cash. The shopkeeper, a round man named Wexler, counted the bills and said nothing about the unusual purchase. A rancher of Holden Caldwell's standing did not need to explain himself in Laramie. As Holden was leaving the store, the door opened and Sheriff Josiah Holloway walked in. The sheriff was 51 years old, a Union veteran with a gray handlebar mustache and hard gray eyes. He had been the law in Laramie for 11 years. He nodded to Holden. Caldwell. Sheriff. Heard you brought a woman in from the station last night. I did. Young nurse from Virginia. Traveled out here looking for work. Something changed in Sheriff Holloway's face. It was a small change. A tightening around the eyes. A slight compression of the lips beneath the gray mustache. But Holden, whose life as a cavalryman had depended on reading men's faces, saw it. What's her name? The sheriff asked quietly. Bellamy. Adeline Bellamy. Virginia, you said. What town? Richmond. Sheriff Holloway went still the way a man goes still when he sees a rattlesnake in the grass at his feet. Richmond Memorial Hospital. Holden set down the bundle he was carrying. Sheriff, what do you know that I don't? The older man looked at him for a long moment. Then he glanced at the shopkeeper and jerked his head toward the door. The two men stepped outside into the cold afternoon sunlight. Sheriff Holloway took off his hat and ran a hand through thinning gray hair. Holden. There was a doctor at Richmond Memorial, a man named Thaddeus Ashford. Came there from Boston about a year ago. He did things in Boston and in Philadelphia and in other places to certain women. Young women. Nurses mostly. Women who worked under him. What kinds of things? The kind of things a decent man does not speak of. Holden's jaw tightened. My sister's name was Adelaide Holloway. She was 24 years old. She worked at a hospital in Boston in the spring of 1884. In May of that year, she was found dead in her rented room. They called it a suicide. I have spent 3 years trying to prove otherwise. The sheriff put his hat back on. Thaddeus Ashford was the last man to see her alive. Holden felt the cold go out of the air around him. You think he hurt your sister? I know he hurt my sister. I just can't prove it. Not yet. And now he's in Richmond. Was in Richmond. I had a telegraph from a Pinkerton man 2 weeks ago. Ashford's left the hospital there. There was some kind of incident, an assault. A nurse defended herself and Ashford took a scalpel to the face, and the hospital dismissed her. The sheriff's gray eyes met Holden's. That nurse's name, Holden, was Adeline Bellamy. The two men stood for a long moment in the snow-bright Wyoming afternoon. "Sheriff," Holden said quietly, "I have just hired that young woman to be the nurse of my ranch." "Then God has been listening to both our prayers, son, because Ashford is not done with her." "How do you know?" "Because men like him are never done. They come back. They always come back." He put a hand on Holden's shoulder. "Keep her close. Keep her armed. And when the day comes, you come to me. I have spent 3 years waiting for a chance to see that man answer for what he did to my Adelaide. You'll have your chance, Sheriff." "Yes, I believe I will." Holden rode out of Laramie the next morning with Adeline Bellamy on a gentle bay mare he had purchased for her at the livery. She rode well. He had wondered if she would. She was a surgeon's daughter from Virginia, and surgeons' daughters in Virginia had been taught to ride before they were taught to read. The Wyoming country opened up around them as they moved north. Great white plains stretched to the horizon, broken by stands of leafless cottonwoods along the frozen creeks. In the far distance, the Medicine Bow Range rose up into a sky so blue it hurt the eyes. They did not speak much on the ride. There was no need to. Adeline watched the country the way a person watches a language being spoken that she has never heard before. Holden watched her from the corner of his eye and said nothing. 4 hours into the ride, they crested a low ridge and stopped. The valley below them was the Valley of the Broken Arrow, a main house of squared logs and river stone, with a wide covered porch and smoke rising from twin chimneys, a long bunkhouse, stables, a blacksmith shop, corrals of peeled pine, a creek running black and fast between its banks of ice, and cattle, thousands of cattle, dark against the snow, scattered across pastures that ran all the way to the foot of the mountains. Adeline drew in a small breath. "It's beautiful. My wife used to say it looked like God's own pasture." She was right. Holden did not answer. He was looking at the main house, at the porch where Cordelia had once stood with her hand on her swollen belly, waving goodbye to him as he rode out for the roundup. He had not brought another woman to this place in 3 years. But here he was, bringing one now. "Miss Bellamy," he said. "Yes, I have to tell you something. Before we ride down there is a thing I should have told you in Laramie, and I didn't because I wanted you to come. I'll tell you now, and if you wish to turn back, I'll ride you back myself." She turned in the saddle to face him. "Sheriff Holloway came to see me yesterday. He told me what Dr. Ashford did to his sister in Boston 3 years ago. He told me what Dr. Ashford did to you at Richmond Memorial." He paused. "He also told me that Ashford is not a man who lets a thing go. He told me the man will come looking for you." Her face went very pale beneath her dark hair, but her eyes did not waver. "I know," she said. "I have known since the night I left Virginia." "Then you must also know this. If that man sets 1 foot on my land, Miss Bellamy, I will put him in the ground. I want you to understand what you are riding into. A long silence. Somewhere down in the valley, a rooster crowed. The sound carried up to them on the clear, cold air. Mr. Caldwell, I rode out here because I had nowhere else to go. I did not expect to find a man like you at the end of the road. Her voice was steady. If he comes, we will face him together. And I will not need you to put him in the ground. I will help you dig the hole. Holden Caldwell looked at Adeline Bellamy for a long moment. Then he touched the brim of his hat, and he turned his horse and he led her down into the valley of the Broken Arrow, where 45 men waited to meet the woman who was about to change all of their lives. A mile away, watching from the crest of a cedar-dotted ridge, a man in a black wool coat lowered his field glasses. He wrote 3 words in a small leather notebook, tore the page free, folded it, and tucked it into his saddlebag to be mailed from the next town. The 3 words were, "She is here." He signed his name at the bottom, Lucius Blackwood. Then he wheeled his horse and he rode south toward the railhead, and the wind rose again out of the mountains, cold and patient, and carrying the promise of worse storms to come. The valley of the Broken Arrow received Adeline Bellamy the way a man receives a gift he is afraid to open. 45 cowboys stood ranged along the porch of the bunkhouse as Holden rode her down through the snowy yard that afternoon, every one of them in his Sunday best, every one of them with his hat in his hand. Word had ridden ahead of them from the ridge. The boss was bringing home a nurse from Laramie, and a man who rides for another man's brand knows how to show proper respect when the lady of the house arrives, even when the lady is not the lady of the house at all. Holden swung down first. He reached up for her, and Adeline laid her gloved hands on his shoulders and let him set her gently in the packed snow. "Gentlemen," Holden said. His voice carried across the yard the way a ranch boss learns to make his voice carry. "This is Miss Adeline Bellamy. She has been engaged as the nurse of the Broken Arrow. You will give her every courtesy. You will call her ma'am. You will not enter her cabin without her invitation. You will come to her when you are hurt, and you will do what she tells you when you do, and you will thank her when she is finished. She is now part of this outfit. Any man who forgets that will answer to me." 45 men nodded. 45 men said, "Yes, sir," in one low, rough chorus. And then the oldest of them stepped forward. Fletcher McCrae was 59 years old that December, a veteran of Shiloh and Chickamauga with a beard like old silver and eyes the color of riverstone. He had come to the Broken Arrow in 1879 to die, and had stayed on to live instead, and Holden Caldwell loved him the way a man loves the father that God had forgotten to send him. Fletcher walked up to Adeline, removed his battered hat, and held it against his chest. "Ma'am, I was the foreman here when Mortimer Dooley died. I am sorry for your loss, Mr. McCrae. I was the one who dug his grave." The old man's voice did not waver. "I have dug too many graves, ma'am. I am tired of digging graves. If you can keep these boys out of the ground, I will ride through fire for you." Adeline's chin lifted. "Then we understand each other, sir." Fletcher McCrae put his hat back on his head and stepped aside. She had passed the first test. Her cabin stood 50 yards from the main house, built new the previous autumn, when Holden had first started writing letters to Chicago and Denver looking for a nurse. It was a 2-room affair of squared logs, chinked with moss and lime, with a covered porch facing the morning sun and a tin chimney that drew clean. Inside was a small parlor with a pot-bellied stove, a writing desk, and 2 good chairs. A bedroom with a brass bed and a cedar chest. And a third room Holden had added on at his own expense, larger than either of the others, fitted out with a long examining table of oak glass-fronted cabinets, full of bandages and instruments, a surgical lamp imported from Chicago, and a full set of apothecary bottles whose labels Adeline read in slow, wondering disbelief. It was better equipped than the ward she had worked in at Richmond Memorial. She turned to Holden. "How long have you been preparing this room?" "I ordered the fittings last April. The table was built in September. The lamp arrived in October. I did not know what woman I was waiting for, Miss Bellamy. I only knew I was waiting. Mr. Caldwell." "Yes." "Thank you." "You are welcome, Miss Bellamy." He touched the brim of his hat and walked out and closed the door behind him and left her standing alone in the first room she had ever owned in her entire life. She sat down on the edge of the examining table and she wept for 7 minutes without making a single sound. 3 days after Adeline Bellamy arrived at the Broken Arrow Ranch, a cowboy named Beauregard Green came off his horse in the south pasture, and a front hoof came down on his right thigh. They carried him into her infirmary on a blanket between 4 men. The leg was broken below the hip. The bone had pushed through the skin. He was white with shock, and blood was running off the edge of the examining table in a steady red line that Fletcher McCrae was catching in a tin pan. Fletcher turned to Adeline. "Ma'am, if I ride for Dr. Cartwright in Laramie right now, I can be back by dusk tomorrow." "Mr. McCrae." Adeline had already taken off her shawl. She was rolling up the sleeves of her blue cotton dress. "By dusk tomorrow, this boy will be dead. The artery is cut. I can see the bleed from here. Ma'am." "Mr. McCrae, boil water, bring me clean sheets. Send for Mr. Caldwell. And I need 4 strong men to hold him down, because I do not have enough ether to put him all the way under." Fletcher McCrae looked at her for 3 long seconds. Then he turned and he shouted orders, and inside of 2 minutes there was a pot of water on the stove and 4 cowboys holding Beauregard Green's shoulders and knees. Adeline opened her father's case. She took out the bone saw Reginald Bellamy had carried through 4 years of war. She took out the catgut suture. She took out the curved needle. She set them on a clean white cloth. Holden Caldwell came through the door. He took one look at the table and he did not ask any questions. And he walked to the head of the table and he put both of his hands on Beauregard Green's shoulders. "Beau, son, look at me. Mr. Caldwell, this woman is going to save your leg. You are going to be still. You are going to hold on to my hands. And when this is over, you are going to walk out of this room and you are going to ride again. Do you hear me?" "Yes, sir." Adeline Bellamy began to work. She worked for 2 hours and 11 minutes. She set the bone. She tied off the artery. She cleaned the wound with carbolic acid. And she stitched the muscle and she closed the skin with 37 small, careful sutures that her mother had taught her how to make. When she was finished, Beauregard Green was still breathing and his leg was still attached. And Fletcher McCrae was standing in the corner of the room with his hat in his hands. The old foreman walked up to the table. He looked at Adeline. He looked at the closed wound. He looked back at Adeline. "Ma'am, I am 60 years old next month. I have seen surgeons in Atlanta. I have seen Army surgeons in Tennessee. I have not seen hands like those. Adeline was washing blood off her own hands in the basin. She did not look up. My father's hands, Mr. McCrae. I only borrow them. Fletcher McCrae put his hat back on his head. He walked out of the infirmary, and from that day forward, no man who rode for the Broken Arrow brand ever called her anything but ma'am. And when Fletcher McCrae said the word, he said it the way another man might say a prayer. The snows of January came down hard and early. By the middle of the month, the pastures of the Broken Arrow lay under 5 feet of drifted white, and the creek ran black between banks of ice, thick enough to drive a wagon across. Holden lost 2 calves to wolves the first week, and 3 more to the cold. And by the end of the month, his hands were riding 12-hour days just to keep the herd fed and counted. Adeline rode with them when she could. She had not planned to ride with them. She had planned to wait in her cabin and treat the men when they came back hurt. But on the 3rd morning of the new year, Wyatt Tanner came into the bunkhouse with a hand that had swollen to twice its proper size, and she treated him for a broken finger bone. And as she was splinting it, she asked where he had been hurt, and he said a line shack 12 miles out. And she asked him what he had been doing there, and he said, thawing out frozen water troughs. Because the boys out there were snowed in, and nobody had taken them hot food in 3 days. She packed her medical bag that afternoon and rode out with the supply wagon. She found the line shack. She found 4 men inside it, half frozen and hungry, and already starting to come down with lung fever from the damp. She spent the night there nursing them with hot broth and mustard plasters and willow bark tea. And in the morning she rode back to the ranch with 2 of the men on horseback behind her and 2 more in the wagon, and she did not lose a single one of them. It was Fletcher McCrae who named her the Angel. He said it over supper in the main house a week later, holding a cup of coffee in his scarred old hands. And he said it quietly, the way a man speaks the name of something holy. Adeline had ridden out again that morning, this time, to a homesteader's cabin, 15 miles west, where a child had been born 3 weeks premature and was not expected to live the week. That ain't a nurse, Holden. Fletcher spoke into his coffee. That is an angel in a nurse's apron. God has finally sent this country what it needed. Holden said nothing. He sat at the head of his own table and looked into the fire. And he did not dare to say what he was thinking. He was thinking that his heart had begun to pound when Adeline had ridden out that morning and had not stopped pounding until she rode back in at dusk. He was thinking that he had stood at the window of his study the entire time she was gone, watching the horizon, the way a man watches for a ship. He was thinking that he had not felt this way since Cordelia, and it terrified him. The homesteader's child lived. Word of that birth spread from cabin to cabin across the Wyoming territory, the way word only spreads in country, where news is rare and hope is rarer. Within a month, there were families riding 30 miles through snow to reach the Broken Arrow, with a sick child or a woman in a difficult labor, or a husband with a wound that had not healed right. Holden had the bunkhouse boys build a waiting room onto the side of her infirmary. Adeline turned no one away. She charged nothing. Holden paid for everything: bandages, laudanum, quinine by the pound, suture thread from Chicago, carbolic acid by the case. He paid, and he did not complain, and he watched her ride out into the mornings and ride in at the dusks. And some nights, after the supper dishes were cleared, he would walk out to her cabin and find her sitting on her porch, wrapped in a wool blanket, looking at the stars and he would sit down in the other chair without being asked, and they would not speak for an hour at a time, and neither one of them could have told you later what had been said in those silences, only that something was being said that neither of them had words for yet. The first night he brought her coffee. The second night she brought him coffee back. By the third week of January it had become a thing they did, without speaking of it, without naming it. Two damaged people sitting side by side in the Wyoming dark, watching their breath turn white in the starlight. One night in early February, as the moon rose over the Medicine Bow Range and filled the valley with a cold blue light, Adeline spoke. "Mr. Caldwell, tell me about your wife." Holden sat very still. "I have not spoken of her in 3 years. Then perhaps it is time." He thought for a long while. He thought so long that she believed he would not answer. Her name was Cordelia Fairfax. Her people were from Philadelphia. Her father was a railroad man, and she grew up in a house with 16 rooms. And she did not belong in this country any more than a hothouse rose belongs in a snowbank. His voice had gone very quiet. But she loved me, and I loved her. And she followed me out here because she believed that where a man is, a woman should be. And she died in that bedroom in the main house, trying to bring our son into the world. What was your son's name? I named him after my father, Joseph. He was born dead, Miss Bellamy. He never drew a breath. I buried them in the same coffin. She was holding him when I closed the lid." Adeline did not speak. She reached across the small space between their chairs, and she laid her hand on his. Holden Caldwell looked down at the hand on his own. He did not move it. He did not speak. He sat there in the cold blue moonlight for a long time, with a woman's hand resting on his, and he felt something he had thought was dead inside him begin very slowly to come back to life. "There was a doctor," he said at last. "A new doctor. He had come to Denver for the winter. I rode out to fetch him. It took me 2 days. When I got there, he was not at his rooms. I waited 12 hours. He never came. I rode back home through a storm, and when I got there, she was already gone." "What was his name, Mr. Caldwell?" "Ashford." The word hung between them in the dark. Adeline took her hand away, slowly, carefully, as if it had been burned. Holden. It was the first time she had called him by his Christian name. "Tell me that word again." "Thaddeus Ashford." He was calling himself a consulting physician. He had been engaged for a week at a hotel in Denver. I have spent 3 years looking for him. He disappeared back east before I could find him. She sat very still in the starlight. He could hear her breathing. Short, careful breaths, the way a woman breathes when she is trying not to let the world see she has been struck. "He killed your wife." "He did not come when he was called." "I don't know if that is the same thing." "It is the same thing, Holden. I know this man. I know what he is. He refused to come because he did not want to travel in the weather. He refused because he was drunk. He refused because he had another woman in his rooms. It does not matter why. He is a man who lets women die and feels nothing afterward." Her voice had gone cold as the January air. "And now he is coming for me." Holden turned his face to her in the dark. "Let him come." They sat together a long time more that night, and they did not speak again. But something had been decided in that silence that neither of them would ever need to say aloud. They were not two people sitting on a porch anymore. They were a standing army of two. In the middle of February, a stranger rode into Laramie on a tall gray horse. He was a thin man in a long black wool coat with pale eyes and a neatly trimmed mustache and fine leather gloves that had not been bought in any store west of the Missouri River. He called himself a cattle buyer from Kansas City. He asked a great many questions in the Whiskey Rose Saloon about the Broken Arrow Ranch, and about its owner, and about the nurse who had recently come to work there. He bought drinks. He listened carefully to every answer he was given. Fletcher McCrae was in Laramie that day, buying salt and nails. He stood quiet at the far end of the bar, and he listened and he remembered the face, and he rode home that night at a hard canter, and came straight into the main house of the Broken Arrow, without knocking. Holden was at the supper table. Adeline had joined him there for the first time that week. Rosalind Whitlock, the cook's wife, had set a third place. Fletcher pulled out the empty chair and sat down, and he did not bother to take off his hat. There was a man in Laramie today asking about Miss Bellamy by name. Adeline set down her fork. What sort of man? Thin, black coat. Kansas City, he said. He's a liar. He's no more a cattle buyer than I am the King of Spain. He rode a livery horse and he wore gloves a rancher could not afford. He had the look Holden, the look of a man who kills for money. Holden nodded slowly. Did he give a name? Blackwood. Lucius Blackwood. Adeline went white. I have heard that name. There was a newspaper story in Boston 4 years ago. A woman named Priscilla Hayes was found dead in her hotel room. The detectives named a suspect. A man named Lucius Blackwood. The charges were dropped when the witnesses changed their testimony. Who was Priscilla Hayes? A nurse. She had testified against a surgeon in a malpractice suit. The surgeon's name was not given in the papers, but I know now who he was. The three of them sat at the supper table in a silence so complete they could hear the fire in the stove. He is coming for me, Adeline said quietly. Ashford has sent this man to kill me. Holden stood up from the table. Fletcher. Double the night watch. 2 men at the gate. 2 men on the ridge. 2 men at her cabin. I want Ambrose to take the first patrol himself. No one rides on or off this ranch alone from this night forward. Yes, sir. Miss Bellamy, you will move into the main house tonight. You will take Cordelia's old bedroom, which has been empty these 3 years. I will sleep in the parlor on the sofa. I do not care how it looks to the men. I care how you will look lying dead on the floor of your own cabin. She did not argue. That was how much she had already come to trust him. She slept that night in the bed that Cordelia Caldwell had died in, and Holden Caldwell slept on a horsehair sofa in the front room with a loaded Winchester across his knees. And outside in the frozen Wyoming dark, Ambrose Morrison and 4 armed cowboys walked slow, patient circles around the house until dawn. The attack came on the 4th night. It came not at the cabin, which was empty, and not at the main house, which was guarded, but on the high west pasture, where Wyatt Tanner had been sent with 2 other hands to salt the cattle at dusk. Adeline had ridden out with them. She had not been meant to, but a homesteader's boy named Corbett had broken his arm the day before at a cabin 8 miles beyond the west pasture, and Adeline had gone to reset the splint. and on the ride back the 3 cowboys had fallen in alongside her as her escort. They were in a narrow draw between 2 walls of red rock, a place the men called Raven's Pass, when the first shot was fired. The bullet took Wyatt Tanner high in the left shoulder and knocked him backward out of his saddle into the snow. The second shot killed the horse of the second cowboy, a man named Beauregard Green. The third shot missed Adeline's head by 6 inches and punched a hole through the crown of her hat. She was already off her horse by then, rolling behind a granite boulder with her medical bag clutched to her chest. Her right hand found the small Colt Derringer that Holden had given her 3 weeks earlier, and she worked back the hammer with the ball of her thumb, and she lay flat in the snow and she waited. Up above them on the rim of the draw, 3 men in black coats were picking their way down through the rocks. Abner Harlan, Zebediah Crow, and Lucius Blackwood himself. Wyatt Tanner was bleeding out in the snow 15 feet from where Adeline lay hidden. She could hear him breathing. It was the wrong kind of breathing. It was the wet, shallow breathing of a man whose lung has been opened. If she did not reach him in the next 4 minutes, he was going to die there, 18 years old in a snowbank, because men paid by a Boston surgeon had come to kill a woman they had never met. She made a decision. She crawled. She crawled through the snow with the medical bag dragging behind her, staying below the sight lines of the men working down through the rocks until she reached Wyatt. She rolled him onto his side. She tore open his coat with both hands. The wound was where she had feared it would be, just below the collarbone, and the air was whistling in and out of it with every ragged breath he drew. She pulled a square of oiled silk from her bag. She pressed it over the wound and sealed it to his skin with her bare palm. She did all of this in perhaps 30 seconds. She had seen her father do it once in 1873 on a railroad brakeman who had been shot by a drunk passenger, and she had watched the brakeman live, and she had never forgotten the way her father's hands had moved. Above her on the ridge, a man's voice called out, "Miss Bellamy, you may as well come out. You are outnumbered and you are outgunned and nobody is coming for you." She did not answer, because somebody was coming for her. He had been coming for her from the moment the first shot was fired, and his horse was already up the back side of the draw. And the man who was about to round the boulder above Abner Harlan did not announce himself. Holden Caldwell put a .44 caliber bullet through Abner Harlan's right lung at a distance of 20 feet. Harlan went down without making a sound. Zebediah Crow turned toward the sound of the shot, bringing his rifle up, and Fletcher McRae shot him through the right side from the opposite ridge with a Spencer carbine that had killed Union soldiers at Shiloh 25 years earlier. Lucius Blackwood, who was a professional, did not fire. He dropped his rifle in the snow. He raised both hands over his head. He stood very still on a narrow ledge of red rock in the fading February light, and he smiled a small, thin smile as a dozen broken arrow hands came up out of the rocks around him with their weapons leveled at his chest. "Gentlemen," Lucius Blackwood said, "I surrender." Holden Caldwell came down off the ridge at a run. He went past Blackwood without looking at him. He went past Harlan's body and Crow's bleeding form. He went to the boulder where Adeline was kneeling in a spreading circle of Wyatt Tanner's blood, and he dropped to his knees beside her, and he said, "What do you need?" "I need boiling water, and I need it in 10 minutes. "You will have it in 7. He stood. He shouted 3 names. Ambrose Morrison was already coming down the draw with 2 canteens of water, and a bundle of kindling and a fire was lit in the snow inside of 3 minutes, and a tin pot was set on it. And Adeline Bellamy went to work on Wyatt Tanner with a scalpel her father had carried at Gettysburg, and a pair of forceps she had boiled in creek water, and she opened the boy's chest between his 2nd and 3rd ribs, and reached inside him with her bare fingers and pinched shut the artery that was trying to kill him. She worked for 41 minutes. Snow fell the entire time. Holden Caldwell held the lantern she had asked for above her head for all 41 of those minutes, and his arms began to shake at minute 20, and he did not lower them. And when she finally tied off the last suture and pressed a clean pad of gauze against the closed wound, Wyatt Tanner was still breathing. He was breathing steady. He was going to live. Adeline sat back in the red snow. Her hands were shaking. Her apron was soaked through with a boy's blood from her collarbone to her knees. Holden Caldwell lowered the lantern. He set it in the snow. He knelt down in front of her and he took her bloody, shaking hands in his own. "Miss Bellamy." "Yes." "Adeline." "Yes." "I am going to ask you a question, and I am going to ask it once, and I would like you to think carefully before you answer. Ask me, Holden, when all of this is finished, when the man who sent those killers is in the ground or on the end of a rope, when you are safe and my men are safe, and there is no more blood to be cleaned from anybody's apron, will you do me the honor of being my wife?" She looked at him for a long time in the falling snow. "Yes," she said. "I will." He did not kiss her. There was a dying boy between them, and a killer in irons behind them, and the blood of 3 men on the snow. And it was not the time or the place, but he lifted her bloody right hand to his mouth, and he pressed his lips to her knuckles gentle as a man kisses a child, and he held it there for one long breath. "Then we have work to do." "Yes, Holden, we do." They carried Wyatt Tanner home on a travois. They carried the bodies of Abner Harlan and Zebediah Crow home tied across their saddles. They brought Lucius Blackwood home alive, his hands bound with rawhide, his mouth gagged because he had tried twice on the ride to bargain for his freedom with promises he did not have the right to make. Sheriff Josiah Holloway rode out from Laramie the next morning with 2 deputies. He took Blackwood into custody. He took him to the Laramie jail, and he put him in a cell, and he sat down on a 3-legged stool across from the bars, and he looked at the thin man with the pale eyes for a long time, without speaking. "Mr. Blackwood, my name is Josiah Holloway. In the spring of 1884, my sister Adelaide was found dead in a rented room in Boston. A woman named Priscilla Hayes was found dead in another rented room 2 years later. I have spent 5 years of my life believing that the same man killed both of them. I believe that man is the man who hired you to come to Wyoming. And I'm going to sit here with you, Mr. Blackwood, for as long as it takes, until you tell me his name." Lucius Blackwood smiled his small, thin smile through the bars. "Sheriff," he said, "I will tell you his name right now. I will tell you everything he has ever paid me to do. I will tell you names of women you have never heard of, and places you have never been. I will be the finest witness the territory of Wyoming has ever seen." He leaned closer to the bars. "But I will want something in return." "What do you want, Mr. Blackwood?" "I want to live." Josiah Holloway looked at him a long time. "Mr. Blackwood," the sheriff said at last, "you will live if I say you live. And I will say it if what you tell me is enough to put a rope around Thaddeus Ashford's neck in front of the entire state of Wyoming. Those are my terms. Do we have a deal?" "Sheriff, we have a deal." Lucius Blackwood talked for 6 hours that first day. He talked for 4 more the day after that. Holden Caldwell rode into Laramie 2 weeks later with Fletcher McCrae at his side. He did not go to the sheriff's office. He did not go to the general store. He walked his horse to the hitching post outside the Whiskey Rose Saloon, and he swung down, and he loosened the Colt in his holster. "Holden, Fletcher, son, whatever you are about to do, I am not going to shoot him, Fletcher. I'm going to look him in the eye. I want him to see my face before he sees the judges." Fletcher McCrae nodded once. "Then I will stand behind you, and if he draws, he will not draw on you alone." They walked through the swinging doors of the Whiskey Rose. Thaddeus Ashford was sitting at a table in the back corner with Ezra Pinkerton Vance and Marshall Obadiah Kettering. There was a bottle of Kentucky whiskey between them. The scar on Ashford's face was pale against the red of too much drink. The saloon went still. Holden Caldwell walked the length of that saloon the way a man walks towards something he has been walking toward for 3 years and did not know it. He stopped in front of Ashford's table. "Dr. Ashford." "Mr. Caldwell, you killed my wife." The saloon held its breath. Ashford set down his glass. He tried to smile. The smile did not quite fit his face. "Mr. Caldwell, I do not know what you..." March of 1885, Denver, Colorado. A ranch hand rode 2 days through a blizzard to your hotel room. You were told there was a woman in labor 26 years old who could not deliver her child. You did not come. You were drunk. You had another woman in your bed. I know this because the bellman who brought up your whiskey sent me a signed affidavit 6 weeks ago for $100 in silver, and the promise that I would not use his name in court. Ashford's face had gone the color of old paper. My wife's name was Cordelia Caldwell. Our son's name was Joseph. They are buried on a hill above my ranch. There are cottonwood trees growing over them now, which she planted the year she came to the Broken Arrow as my bride. I have spent 3 years not knowing what happened to you. I know now. Holden leaned down across the table. "I'm not going to kill you tonight, Doctor. I'm going to let the court kill you. Because I want you to have weeks sitting in a jail cell to think about a woman you never met, dying in a pine bed on a ranch you never saw. And when the rope goes around your neck, Doctor, I want Cordelia's name to be the last thing you hear, because I am going to make sure the hangman speaks it." He straightened up. "Finish your whiskey, Doctor. It is the last you will taste." He turned. He walked out of the Whiskey Rose with Fletcher McCrae at his shoulder. Nobody followed them. Thaddeus Ashford had come to Wyoming because Sheriff Josiah Holloway had sent him a telegram. The telegram said that Blackwood had confessed that witnesses had been secured, that a federal warrant had been issued for his arrest, and that he should return himself voluntarily for lenient treatment. The telegram was a lie. There was no federal warrant, not yet. But Sheriff Holloway knew his quarry. He knew a proud man when he had hunted one, and he knew that a proud man who received such a telegram would not run away. A proud man would come west in person to confront his accusers with a team of lawyers and a bought federal marshal, and every weapon his powerful father-in-law could put into his hands. A proud man would ride directly into a trap. On the morning of March the 17th, 1888, a train pulled into the Laramie station, carrying Dr. Thaddeus Ashford, his lawyer Ezra Pinkerton Vance, a federal marshal named Obadiah Kettering, and 6 hired gunmen in long dust coats. They stepped down onto the platform in their fine Eastern clothes. They did not see at first the hundreds of people standing silent along the main street of Laramie. They did not see the 45 cowboys of the Broken Arrow Ranch standing in a line across the street, with their hats pulled low and their hands resting easy on their gun butts. They did not see on the porch of the courthouse at the far end of the street a tall man in a black coat standing beside a dark-haired woman in a blue dress. But they would see them. Before the week was out, they would see them very clearly. Thaddeus Ashford was 46 years old. He wore a black wool suit tailored in Boston, a silk cravat the color of blood, and a pair of patent leather boots that had never touched a ranch. His face was pale and clean-shaven, except for the long purple scar that ran from his left temple, down across his cheek, to the point of his jaw. Adeline Bellamy had put that scar there with her father's scalpel on a November night in Richmond, and every morning since, when Ashford had looked in his shaving mirror, he had remembered it. He had come west to give the scar back to her. He looked around the platform, and his smile faded. The platform was empty. No porters, no travelers, no station master at his post. The entire main street of Laramie, which should have been busy at mid-morning on a Tuesday, was silent. Doors were closed. Windows were shuttered. And at the far end of the street, in front of the wooden courthouse, a crowd of perhaps 300 people stood in absolute silence and watched him. Ezra Pinkerton Vance stepped down behind him, adjusting his spectacles. "Doctor, this is irregular." "It is theater," Ashford said. "The sheriff is attempting to intimidate us." Marshal Obadiah Kettering stepped down next, his hand resting on the butt of the Colt at his hip. Behind him came the 6 hired gunmen, hard, thin men in long dust coats, with rifles held across their forearms, and eyes that had already begun to count the cowboys standing in a line across the street 30 yards away. "Doctor," Kettering said quietly, "I count about 50 men, and that is only the ones I can see." "Then you had best remember whose authority you carry, Marshal." "I remember, Doctor. But this is not Washington, and I am wondering just now whether the paper in my pocket is worth the rifle bullets in front of me." Ashford did not answer him. He was looking at the courthouse porch. A tall, dark-haired man in a black frock coat stood at the top of the steps, his left hand resting easy on the porch rail, his right hand empty at his side. Beside him stood a woman in a dark blue dress. Her hair was pinned up beneath a small hat. Her hands were folded in front of her. She was looking directly at Thaddeus Ashford across the length of the main street of Laramie, Wyoming, and she was not afraid. Adeline Bellamy was not afraid anymore. Ashford felt something shift in the air around him, something cold, something final. Sheriff Josiah Holloway came down the courthouse steps. He walked the length of the street toward the train platform alone. His hat was tipped back on his head. His badge caught the morning light. He stopped 10 feet from Thaddeus Ashford. and he looked the doctor up and down the way a man looks at a horse he is about to put down. "Dr. Ashford." "Sheriff, you will hand over your sidearm. You will instruct your gunmen to lay their weapons on the platform. You will walk with me to the courthouse where Judge Cornelius Winthrop is waiting to preside over a hearing into the matters of which you have been accused. Your lawyer may accompany you. Your marshal may accompany you. Your hired guns will be held at the livery stable under guard until the hearing is concluded." "Sheriff, I have a federal marshal in my company. I have legal warrants. You have no authority to." "Doctor," Josiah Holloway's voice was very quiet. "Look down this street. Look at those 300 people. Look at those 45 cowboys. Look at the man on the courthouse porch. Then tell me again about my authority." Ashford looked. He saw for the first time what he had ridden into, and he understood for the first time in his life that there were places in this country where the name Pemberton meant nothing. He unbuckled his gun belt. He laid it on the platform at his feet. His 6 gunmen, after a long glance at Marshal Kettering, did the same with their rifles. And Thaddeus Ashford of Boston and Richmond and the Pemberton family residence walked down the main street of Laramie, Wyoming, flanked by the sheriff and the marshal and his attorney. And every step of the way, he felt the eyes of 300 strangers on him. And not one of those eyes looked away. The courthouse of Albany County was a single-story building of squared pine logs, with a shingle roof and a bell in a small tower that was rung only when a jury reached its verdict. On that morning, every seat inside it was filled. Every window outside it had a face pressed against the glass. Men stood shoulder to shoulder in the aisles. Women stood in the doorway. Children sat on the floor beneath the wooden benches. Judge Cornelius Winthrop was 67 years old. He had been a Union captain at Antietam. He had lost his right arm to a Confederate shell at Cold Harbor. He sat behind his bench now, with the empty sleeve pinned to his coat, and his one remaining hand resting flat upon the Bible. And when he rapped his gavel, the room fell silent as a tomb. "This is a preliminary hearing into the conduct of Dr. Thaddeus Ashford of Richmond, Virginia, pursuant to charges brought before this court by the sheriff of Albany County. The charges are conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to kidnap, attempted murder of Miss Adeline Bellamy, attempted murder of Mr. Wyatt Tanner, a citizen of this territory, suborning of perjury, bribery of a federal officer, forgery of federal warrants." The judge's single remaining hand tightened on the Bible. "Further charges will be addressed pertaining to the deaths of several women in the states of Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and Virginia, pending the testimony before this court. Counsel for the defense, are you prepared?" Ezra Pinkerton Vance rose from his chair. "Your Honor, my client does not recognize the jurisdiction of this court. He is a citizen of Virginia. The alleged offenses did not occur in this territory. We request an immediate dismissal." Judge Winthrop looked at the lawyer for a long, cold moment. "Counselor, the alleged offenses did occur in this territory. 3 men hired by your client fired upon citizens of this territory in a canyon 20 miles north of where you presently stand. 2 of those men are dead. 1 of those men is in my jail. The bullets still exist. Miss Bellamy's hat with a bullet hole through the crown is sitting on the evidence table to your left. I have jurisdiction, counselor. Sit down." The lawyer sat down. Thaddeus Ashford did not look at him. Thaddeus Ashford was looking at Adeline Bellamy, who was sitting in the front row of the gallery beside Holden Caldwell. And Adeline Bellamy was looking back at him, and her gray-blue eyes did not waver, and there was no fear in her at all. Sheriff Holloway called his first witness. Zebediah Crow was brought in from the jail in leg irons. He was pale. His right arm hung in a sling from the wound Fletcher McCrae had given him at Raven's Pass. He was placed on the witness stand and sworn in and asked to tell the court who had hired him to ride with Lucius Blackwood to Wyoming Territory in February of 1888. Crow looked at Thaddeus Ashford across the courtroom. That man right there. He paid $2,000 in gold. He said the nurse had to die by the end of February. He said it had to look like she took her own life, same as the others. Same as the others? Yes, sir. What others, Mr. Crow? Blackwood said there had been 4 before her. Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, Richmond. He said Dr. Ashford had been doing it for years. He said nobody ever caught him because he married into the Pemberton family, and the Pemberton family bought off every investigation. A low sound moved through the courtroom. Judge Winthrop rapped his gavel once. Continue. Zebediah Crow continued for 40 minutes. He was followed by Lucius Blackwood himself, who walked into the courtroom in leg irons and sat on the stand and smiled his small, thin smile, and told a story that took an hour and a half to tell. And by the end of it, 3 women in the gallery were weeping openly, and 1 man had been escorted from the room for shouting at the defendant. And Thaddeus Ashford had gone the color of wet ashes. Blackwood named every woman Ashford had paid him to kill. He named Priscilla Hayes, the nurse in Boston. He named a woman in Philadelphia named Theodora Ellsworth. He named a German immigrant nurse in Baltimore named Hildegard Reinhold. He named a young woman in Richmond named Philomena Simmons, who had worked under Ashford for 2 weeks before she fell from a 4th-story hospital window. Under circumstances the hospital had ruled a suicide. And he named a 5th woman, one he had not killed himself, but who he had watched Thaddeus Ashford send men to kill 4 years earlier. Her name was Adelaide Holloway, Lucius Blackwood said into the silent courtroom. She was the sister of the sheriff sitting at that table. I was in Boston the night she died. I was meant to help. I did not. I turned the job down. I told Ashford I would not kill a preacher's daughter in her own bed. But another man did. And Dr. Ashford paid him $600 in United States gold. Sheriff Josiah Holloway sat at the prosecution table and put his face in his hands. Thaddeus Ashford stood up. This is a lie. This entire proceeding is a lie. This man is a paid witness, a murderer himself, and he is trading his life for slander. My father-in-law is a United States Senator. My wife is. Mr. Ashford. Judge Winthrop's voice cut him off like a rifle shot. You will sit down. You will be silent, or I will have you gagged in my courtroom. Do I make myself clear? Ashford sat down. Millicent Thornton was called next. She had come from Boston by train. She was 34 years old, a widow, the head matron of the Massachusetts General Nursing School. She had worked under Thaddeus Ashford in 1883 at a hospital in Cambridge. She told the court in a voice that did not waver what he had done to her in a linen closet on a Tuesday afternoon 20 years ago, and what he had threatened to do to her if she spoke of it. Winifred Hayward was called after her. She had come from Philadelphia. She was 28 years old. She described how she had seen Thaddeus Ashford administer ether to a sedated patient who was already unconscious, and what he had then done with his hands while his patient could not protest. Honora Emerson was called last among the women. She was 32 years old, a nurse from Baltimore, and she had kept a journal for 4 years. She had written down every incident she had witnessed. She had written down every name she had heard. She opened the journal on the witness stand, and she read from it for 47 minutes in a clear, steady voice. And by the time she was done, there were men in the gallery weeping into their hats. And there was not a single pair of eyes in that courtroom that would meet Thaddeus Ashford's. Judge Winthrop called a recess for the noon meal. He did not call a recess because the court was hungry. He called a recess because he had seen sitting at the prosecution table a man who was trying very hard not to come across the courtroom and strangle the defendant with his one remaining hand. And that man was Sheriff Josiah Holloway, and the judge wanted to give him half an hour to walk it off. When court resumed the prosecution, called its final witness, Adeline Margaret Bellamy walked to the witness stand in her dark blue dress. She placed her left hand on the Bible. She raised her right hand. She swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help her God. And then she sat down in the wooden chair, and she looked at Thaddeus Ashford across the well of the courtroom for the first time since she had cut his face open in November. She was not afraid of him anymore. She told the court plainly, and without embellishment, what he had done to her in the supply closet of Richmond Memorial Hospital on the night of November the 12th. She told how he had pressed her against the shelves. She told how his hands had gone around her throat when she fought him. She told how she had reached behind her for any weapon she could find, and her fingers had closed on the handle of her father's scalpel, where she had left it wrapped in cotton on the third shelf, and she had drawn it across his face without thinking. She told how he had fallen back bleeding, how she had run, how the hospital had believed his story, not hers, how she had been dismissed, how she had been threatened, how her reputation had been ruined across the state of Virginia in the space of 3 days, how she had boarded a train west with $7 in her purse and her father's surgical case in her arms, how she had come to be freezing in a train station in Laramie on a December night, how she had been found. Her voice did not break, not once. When she was finished, Judge Winthrop leaned forward over his bench. "Miss Bellamy, is there anything else you wish to say to this court?" She looked at Thaddeus Ashford. "Yes, Your Honor, there is." "Proceed." Adeline Bellamy stood up in the witness box. "Dr. Ashford, my father was a surgeon. He taught me that our work was a sacred trust. He taught me that a patient who lies down on a table puts her life in our hands, and that to betray that trust is the worst sin a man in our profession can commit. My father died believing those words. He died poor. He died with one leg because the other had been taken at Gettysburg. He died with nothing to leave me but his tools." She turned her eyes to the gallery. "I have used those tools now, Dr. Ashford, to cut your face, and I have used them to save the life of an 18-year-old cowboy named Wyatt Tanner, whom your hired men shot at Raven's Pass. I have used them to deliver babies in cabins 40 miles from any other help. I have used them to save a homesteader's son, and to bring a baby girl through a breech birth, and to set the broken leg of a miner's widow. She looked back at Ashford. Your tools, doctor, have been used to destroy women. Mine have been used to save them. That is the difference between us. And today, God willing and with the help of this court, your tools will be taken from you forever. She stepped down from the witness stand. The courtroom was silent. And then from the back of the gallery, a man stood up. It was Wyatt Tanner, 18 years old. His left arm still in a sling from the bullet Adeline had pulled out of his chest at Raven's Pass 5 weeks earlier. He had ridden into Laramie that morning on a gentle mare, holding the reins with his right hand. He had not been called as a witness. He was not supposed to speak. He spoke anyway. "That woman saved my life," Wyatt Tanner said. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat. "That woman saved my life in the snow at Raven's Pass, and I am standing here today because of her. And if this court does not hang Dr. Ashford for what he has done, I will find another court that will." Judge Winthrop did not gavel him down. Judge Winthrop looked at Wyatt Tanner for a long moment, and then he looked at Thaddeus Ashford, and he said very quietly, "Son, you sit down. This court will do its duty." Wyatt Tanner sat down. Fletcher McCrae, sitting beside him, laid a hand on his shoulder and did not take it away. Judge Cornelius Winthrop deliberated for 22 minutes in his chambers. When he returned, he did not sit down. He stood behind his bench with his one hand resting on the Bible, and he looked across his courtroom at Thaddeus Ashford of Boston, and he spoke. "Dr. Thaddeus Ashford, I find that there is overwhelming evidence to bind you over for full trial in federal court on the charges of conspiracy to commit murder, the murder of Adelaide Holloway of Boston in 1884, the murder of Priscilla Hayes of Boston in 1886, the murder of Theodora Ellsworth of Philadelphia in 1885, the murder of Hildegard Reinhold of Baltimore in 1886, the murder of Philomena Simmons of Richmond in 1887, the attempted murder of Miss Adeline Bellamy, the attempted murder of Mr. Wyatt Tanner, and various related offenses of forgery, bribery, and criminal assault, numbering at minimum 8 additional counts across 4 states. He drew a slow breath. "I further order that Marshal Obadiah Kettering of the United States Marshal Service be taken into custody on charges of forgery of federal documents, accepting bribes and conspiracy." He drew another breath. "And I further order, by the authority vested in me as the presiding judicial officer of this territory, that you, Dr. Thaddeus Ashford, be remanded to the custody of the Federal District Court at Denver, Colorado, to stand full trial, with my strongest recommendation to that court that upon conviction you be hanged by the neck until you are dead." The gavel came down. Thaddeus Ashford did not scream. He did not protest. He went very white, and he sat down very slowly in his chair, and he stared at the wooden floor of the courthouse. 2 deputies placed iron manacles on his wrists. They walked him out the front door of the courthouse toward the prison wagon that would carry him the 12 miles to the Laramie Territorial Jail. He was halfway across the wooden walk when the rifle shot came. It came from the roof of the bank across the street. The first bullet took one of the deputies high in the chest and killed him before he hit the ground. The second bullet took the other deputy in the left arm. The third bullet was meant for Thaddeus Ashford, and it missed him by 8 inches and tore splinters out of a porch post. because the man on the roof was not trying to kill Ashford. The man on the roof was trying to free him. His name was Silas Ruddock. He had ridden with Lucius Blackwood for 9 years. He had taken $3,000 in gold from the Pemberton family 3 days earlier, with instructions to prevent by any means necessary the hanging of Thaddeus Ashford. He killed the deputy. He wounded the second. He dropped a set of keys onto the walk beside Ashford. Ashford scrambled for the keys with his manacled hands. He got them into the lock. He got one hand free, and he came up off the wooden walk with the dead deputy's revolver in his fist, and he pointed it at the nearest human being he could see, which was Adeline Bellamy standing in the open doorway of the courthouse, with one hand still resting on Holden Caldwell's arm. Holden Caldwell moved before his wife-to-be finished the first word of his name. He shoved her sideways through the open courthouse door. He took Ashford's bullet himself, high on the left shoulder, the same shoulder within an inch where a Lakota bullet had struck him at Wolf Mountain in the winter of 1877. He did not go down. He drew the Colt from his own hip as he staggered, and he brought it up level and across 20 feet of wooden walkway. He looked into the eyes of the man who had killed his first wife and who had just tried to kill his second, and Holden Caldwell fired once. The bullet took Thaddeus Ashford in the right hand. The doctor's gun clattered onto the planks. Ashford screamed. It was a high, thin scream, the scream of a man who had spent his whole life believing that his hands made him powerful, discovering that a cowboy's bullet had just ended that belief forever. On the roof of the bank across the street, a second rifle spoke. It was Fletcher McRae's old Spencer carbine firing from the window of the hotel on the same side of the street. Silas Ruddock rolled once on the tin roof and fell 3 stories into the alley behind the bank, and he was dead before he landed. Sheriff Josiah Holloway was already across the walk. He kicked Ashford's gun into the street. He put a knee in the middle of Ashford's back. He put the barrel of his own Colt against the back of Ashford's neck, and he leaned down, and he spoke 3 words into the doctor's ear that no one else in Laramie ever heard. And Ashford stopped screaming and began very quietly to weep. Holden Caldwell was standing against the courthouse wall. Adeline Bellamy came through the doorway with her medical bag already open. She tore open his shirt. She examined the wound. The bullet had gone clean through the meat of his shoulder and come out the back. It had missed the bone. It had missed the great artery. It had passed within half an inch of the old scar from Wolf Mountain. Holden Caldwell. Her voice was shaking. Her hands were not. You will sit down. You will be still. You will let me stop this bleeding, and then you will go home with me. And you will spend the next 6 weeks letting me tend to you. And you will not say one word of complaint. Do you hear me? Yes, Adeline. Say it again. I hear you. She pressed a folded pad of gauze against the entry wound. She pressed another against the exit. She bound them both with a long strip of white linen, and her blood-stained hands worked the knot at his collarbone. And a crowd of 300 people stood silent in the Laramie street and watched them. When she was done, she put her forehead against his good shoulder. Don't you ever, she whispered, step in front of a bullet for me again. Adeline, yes, I will step in front of every bullet that is ever fired at you until the day I die. That is the arrangement. She did not argue. She put her arm around his waist and she walked him down the courthouse steps, and the crowd parted for them the way a crowd parts for a bride and groom leaving a church. Thaddeus Ashford was dragged away in irons. 3 weeks later, in a federal courtroom in Denver, the trial of Thaddeus Ashford lasted 9 days. 37 witnesses testified against him. The Pemberton family refused to pay for his defense after the second day. His wife, Arabella Pemberton Ashford, filed for divorce on the 6th day. On the morning of the 10th day, the jury deliberated for 1 hour and 14 minutes before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. He was hanged on the 21st of July, 1888, at 7 o'clock in the morning, at the Denver Federal Penitentiary. Senator Hezekiah Pemberton was not in attendance. The senator had already resigned his seat in the United States Senate in disgrace 3 days earlier. The wedding of Holden Caldwell and Adeline Bellamy took place on the afternoon of the 18th of August, 1888, on the front lawn of the main house of the Broken Arrow Ranch, beneath a cottonwood tree that Cordelia Caldwell had planted the summer before she died. Reverend Silas Hartwell performed the ceremony. He was 62 years old. He had known Holden since the year Cordelia was buried, and he had not expected in this life to see Holden Caldwell stand before an altar again. He stood before one now. Adeline wore a white silk dress that had been ordered from a dressmaker in Chicago. Her dark hair was pinned up beneath a small crown of prairie wildflowers that Rosalind Whitlock had gathered that morning at dawn. She carried no bouquet. She carried in her right hand her father's scalpel wrapped in white silk ribbon, because she had decided that the thing which had saved her life would be with her at every important moment that remained in it. Fletcher McCrae gave her away. He walked her across the lawn with his arm through hers, and when they reached the place where Holden stood waiting, Fletcher stopped, and he turned to Holden, and his old gray eyes were wet. "Hon, this woman is the finest thing that ever rode onto this ranch. You see that you treat her accordingly." "Yes, sir, I will. I give her to you freely. But I warn you, if I ever see her cry, I will come for you with my Spencer rifle, and I do not care if I am 90 years old and blind." "Fletcher." "Yes, Holden. You will never have cause to use that rifle." Fletcher McCrae nodded once. He placed Adeline's hand into Holden's. He stepped back and he sat down in the front row beside Wyatt Tanner, whose left arm was out of its sling now, and whose eyes were wet too, though he would never admit it later. Holden took Adeline's hand in his own. Reverend Hartwell read the vows. When it came Holden's turn to speak, he did not use the words the Reverend had prepared. "Adeline." He was looking into her eyes. "I found you in a train station on the coldest night of my life. I did not know when I turned my horse around that I was riding toward my own salvation. I know it now." He drew a breath. "I vow to you that I will never again let a man raise his voice against you in my presence. I vow to you that I will never lie to you, never keep a secret from you, never face a danger you do not face beside me. And I vow to you that on the day I die, whenever that day comes, I will be waiting for you at the gate of heaven, because my life after this one does not begin until you are standing next to me." Adeline could not speak for a moment. When she did, her voice was steady. "Holden, I was a dead woman when you found me. I had made my peace with it. I was singing my father's hymn and I was ready to meet him. And then you came through that door. She lifted her right hand, the one holding the silk-wrapped scalpel. I carried this into a train station. I carry it now to this altar. It is the last thing my father ever gave me. He told me once that a surgeon's tool is a sacred trust to be used for the healing of the world. I did not understand him then. I understand him now. Because you, Holden Caldwell, have been the healing of me. She looked up at him. I will be your wife. I will ride beside you. I will stand beside you. And when the day comes that one of us must go into the ground first, I will wait at that same gate, and I will not go through it without you. Reverend Hartwell pronounced them husband and wife. Holden kissed her. 45 cowboys of the Broken Arrow fired their rifles into the blue Wyoming sky, and the echoes rolled across the valley, and somewhere in the far pastures 1,000 head of cattle lifted their heads to listen. And the wedding of Adeline Bellamy and Holden Caldwell was witnessed by God and by men and by the mountains themselves. The years that followed were good years. Their first child, a daughter named Margaret Adelaide Caldwell, was born in the spring of 1889. Holden named her for Adeline's mother and for Josiah Holloway's sister. And when Sheriff Holloway was told what the baby's middle name would be, he stood very still in the parlor of the main house for a long time before he could speak. Their second child, Joseph Reginald Caldwell, was born in 1891. Holden named him for his own father and for Adeline's. Their third child, Thomas Cordelia Caldwell, was born in 1893. It was Adeline who chose the middle name and Holden who wept when she told him. Adeline founded the Bellamy Caldwell Nursing Institute in Laramie in 1890. It was the first nursing school for women in the territory of Wyoming, which became the state of Wyoming that same year, and which became the first state in the Union to grant women the right to vote. By 1895, the Institute had graduated 214 nurses who rode out to homesteads and mining towns and cattle ranches from the Dakotas to Arizona, carrying her methods with them. Holden built the Caldwell Memorial Hospital in Laramie in 1890, the same year his daughter turned 1 year old. He built it with his own money. He charged nothing to anyone who could not pay. He served in the territorial legislature and then in the state legislature after statehood, and he voted to keep women's suffrage in the state constitution when men from other states came to argue against it. And he told those men in the chamber of the Wyoming State House that any man who did not believe a woman was the equal of a man had never watched his own wife open a boy's chest in the snow. In 1892, Adeline published a book called Frontier Medicine, A Practical Guide. It became a standard text in Western hospitals for 30 years. Fletcher McRae retired as foreman in 1894 at the age of 66. He did not leave the ranch. He moved into a small cabin next to the main house which Holden built for him, and he lived there for another 12 years, and he died in his sleep in the spring of 1906, and he was buried on a hill above the valley of the Broken Arrow, beside Cordelia Caldwell and the infant Joseph, because Holden said that a man who had been his father in everything but blood deserved to rest with the family he had made. On Christmas Eve of 1895, 8 years after the night Adeline had nearly frozen to death in the Laramie train station, the Caldwell family gathered in the main house of the Broken Arrow. Margaret was 6. Joseph was 4. Thomas was 2. There was a fire in the great stone hearth. There were candles in every window. There were pine boughs along the mantelpiece, and a roast goose on the table, and a plum pudding that Rosalind Whitlock had made from her grandmother's recipe. The children sat on the rug before the fire, and Margaret, the eldest, looked up at her mother with serious gray-blue eyes and said, "Mama, tell us again about the night Papa found you." Adeline smiled. "Once upon a time," she said, "there was a young woman who was very frightened and very alone, and she sat down in an empty train station on the coldest night of the year. She thought she was gonna die. So she began to sing a song her own papa used to sing to her, because she did not want to die in silence." Joseph's eyes were wide. "What song, Mama?" "Amazing Grace, my love. The song your grandfather loved best." "Did you die, Mama?" Thomas asked, because Thomas was 2 and had not yet mastered the rules of a story. Holden laughed from his chair by the fire. "No, son, she did not die, because a man on a horse was riding past the station, and he heard a voice singing inside, and he turned his horse around." "Why, Papa?" Holden looked at Adeline across the firelight. "Because his own papa had told him once. He said quietly that the measure of a man in this life is not what he does when the world is watching, but what he does when no one is there to see. And I could not ride on children. Not past that voice. Not on that night." Later, after the children were in bed, Holden and Adeline walked out onto the covered porch of the main house. It was snowing. A gentle Christmas snow falling slow and fat through the lantern light. Holden stood behind her. He wrapped his arms around her. She leaned back against his chest. "Adeline, yes, I never told you. When I heard you singing that night, in the station, yes, I thought it was my mother's ghost. For just a moment, I thought my mother was calling me from the other side. That is why I turned the horse." She went very still in his arms. "Your mother." She sang that hymn every night of my childhood. I had not heard it since she died. I thought I was dreaming. I thought I had gone mad in the cold. And then I came through the door of the station, and I saw you, and I understood that my mother had been calling me from the other side. She had been calling me to you." Adeline turned in his arms. She looked up at his face in the lantern light. "Holden Caldwell," she whispered. "Yes, we were always going to find each other. Do you understand that now?" "Yes, Adeline, I understand." The snow fell on the porch of the main house of the Broken Arrow Ranch. Down in the valley, the windows of the bunkhouse glowed warm and yellow, and 40 men sang Christmas songs in rough, happy voices, and the cattle were quiet in the far pastures, and the mountains stood white against a black sky filled with stars. Holden Caldwell kissed his wife beneath the snow on Christmas Eve of 1895. And the story of the millionaire cowboy and the freezing nurse, which had begun 8 years earlier in an empty train station, on the coldest night anyone in Wyoming could remember, found its final quiet moment of peace, the way all true love stories do. Not in triumph, not in victory, but in the silence of a front porch with snow falling and 2 people holding one another at the end of a long and hard-fought road, and knowing that whatever came next, they would ride it together. The old Laramie train station still stands today, preserved as a museum. Every winter on the first night, the temperature falls below 0, The caretakers place a folded wool shawl on the third bench from the east wall. They have been doing it for over 130 years. Nobody living today can quite remember who started the tradition. But every man and woman in Laramie knows why it is done. It is done to remember a night in December of 1887 when a cowboy heard a woman singing Amazing Grace in the dark and turned his horse and rode toward the sound and changed the world that both of them lived in forever.